August 17, 1859, Savannah, Georgia. The heat that morning was the kind that pressed down on a man like a living thing, thick and wet and mean, wrapping itself around every breath until even the act of standing still required effort. The auction house on Broughton Street had been open since 8 o'clock, and by noon the air inside was almost unbearable, cut through with the stench of unwashed bodies, tobacco smoke, and fear. Fear has a smell if you've never been close enough to it to know. It smells like salt and iron and something animal, something primitive, something that bypasses the thinking mind entirely and speaks directly to whatever part of us still remembers being hunted. That smell was present every day in that building, but on this particular August morning it was stronger than usual. Something was different. The men who had attended these auctions for years, the seasoned planters and overseers and slave traders, who had learned to treat the transactions on that wooden platform with the same emotional neutrality they might apply to purchasing farm equipment, these men were shifting uncomfortably in their chairs. They were avoiding eye contact. They were finding sudden, urgent interest in the plaster patterns on the ceiling, in the scuff marks on the wooden floor, in the view through the high, narrow windows that looked out onto the river. 27 bidding paddles had been issued that morning. By the time the auctioneer called lot 43, only a handful of men were even still in their seats. And when the woman stepped onto the platform, the room went so completely, so absolutely, so overwhelmingly silent that the sound of the auctioneer clearing his throat seemed almost violent. Her name was Celia. She appeared to be in her early 30s, and she moved with a quality that was difficult to name, a kind of deliberate stillness that seemed almost architectural, as if she had built her composure the same way a stonemason builds a wall, one carefully placed piece at a time, mortared with something harder than stone. She was healthy, experienced, literate. The auctioneer listed her qualifications in a flat, fast voice, as though he wanted to get through this particular lot as quickly as possible. Midwife, herb doctor, medical assistant, experienced in household management, starting bid of $10. In a market where a skilled midwife might sell for $800 or more, $10 was not a price, it was an insult. It was the kind of number you assigned to something you were ashamed to be selling at all. And yet no one raised their paddle. The silence stretched out like a held breath. The auctioneer repeated the price. $10. Do I hear $10? The men in the room continued studying their hands, their floors, their ceiling plaster. Nobody moved, nobody spoke. 27 paddles, 27 experienced slave buyers, and not a single one was willing to place even a token bid on a woman who, under any ordinary assessment, should have fetched several $100s at minimum. There was one man in that room who didn't understand the silence. He had arrived in Savannah just 3 weeks earlier. His name was Thomas Cornelius Pewitt, and he had not yet heard the whispers. He had not yet been invited to the conversations that happened in the corridors after the official business concluded. He was 34 years old, flush with inherited Charleston money, eager and ambitious, and operating entirely without the institutional memory that would have kept his paddle down. When the auctioneer called $10 and nobody moved, Thomas Pewitt raised his hand. His bid was accepted before the auctioneer had finished drawing breath. Going once, going twice. Sold for $10 to the gentleman in the blue coat. The gavel came down like a thunderclap. Celia turned her gaze toward Thomas for the first time. He would remember the quality of that look for the rest of his life. It was not hostile, it was not grateful, it was something more unsettling than either of those things. It was the look of someone who had already anticipated exactly this outcome and had already decided what she intended to do about it. Then she was led away and the auction continued, and Thomas Pewitt went to the clerk's office to finalize his purchase, feeling pleased with himself. He had no idea, not even the faintest shadow of an idea, what he had just set in motion. He would not understand it fully until it was far too late to change course, and by the time he did understand, he would no longer be entirely certain that changing course was something he even wanted. This is the story of Waverly Plantation. This is the story of a woman who turned the tools of her oppression into the instruments of her justice. And this is the story of a man who bought a slave for $10, and in doing so purchased something he never bargained for, something ancient, something patient, something that had been waiting a very long time for exactly the right door to open. Welcome to Hollow Century, where forgotten darkness lives. To understand what happened at Waverly Plantation in the year between August 1859 and the fall of 1860, you have to understand the world that produced it. Savannah in 1859 was one of the most prosperous cities in the American South, and that prosperity rested entirely on two foundations: cotton and the human beings who were forced to grow it. The city's port handled millions of pounds of white fiber each year, loading it onto ships bound for the mills of England and the factories of the American North, and the wealth that flowed back from those transactions built the columned mansions, the cobblestone streets, the ornate public squares, and the carefully maintained illusion of a civilization so refined and gracious that the rot at its foundation was simply not discussed in polite company. Chatham County's soil was some of the richest in Georgia. Its growing season was long, its river systems provided irrigation and transport, and its plantation owners were ruthless men operating within a legal framework that had been specifically designed to protect their right to be ruthless. The auction house on Broughton Street was a central institution in this economy. It had been established in 1842, and in the 17 years since its founding, it had processed thousands of human transactions. Men, women, and children had stood on that wooden platform and been sold like furniture, like livestock, like anything except what they actually were. The men who ran the house were professionals. The men who attended were businessmen. And the entire operation was conducted with the same calm, bureaucratic efficiency that you might find in any commercial venue of the era, because in Savannah in 1859, that was precisely what it was. Commerce. Normal, legal, socially accepted commerce. Thomas Cornelius Pewit had grown up adjacent to this world without being fully immersed in it. His father, Edward Pewit, had made the family fortune in Charleston through cotton speculation, a slightly more abstract relationship with the slavery economy than direct plantation ownership. Edward had died the previous spring, leaving Thomas with more money than he knew what to do with, and a driving need to prove himself as something other than his father's son. When the old Waverly Plantation came onto the market that summer, Thomas saw his opportunity. 800 acres of prime river bottomland, a two-story main house with 6 columns across the front portico, 42 enslaved people already attached to the property, and a purchase price low enough that even after repairs and additional purchases, Thomas would have substantial capital remaining. The previous owner had died without heirs. The estate was being liquidated quickly. Thomas bought it sight unseen. He arrived in Chatham County in late July and spent his first weeks introducing himself to his neighbors, attending the social events through which Georgia's planting class conducted much of its actual business, and assessing the state of his new property. The Waverly house needed work. The fields had been undermanaged during the uncertainty following the previous owner's death. His overseer, a lean, efficient man named Hutchkins who had come with the property, informed Thomas that they were short-handed. To work 800 acres of cotton land properly for the coming season, they would need at least 60 workers. They currently had 42. Thomas needed to purchase at minimum 18 more before the full labor demands of the harvest season arrived. Hence his presence at the Broughton Street auction house on the morning of August 17th. He arrived early, took a seat near the front, and spent the morning bidding carefully and methodically. By noon he had purchased 4 people, 3 young men suited for field labor and an experienced cook. He had spent nearly $5,000. He felt good about his choices. He felt like a man learning his business. During the lunch break, standing just inside the doorway to catch what little breeze the August air offered, Thomas overheard 2 planters talking behind him. He recognized both men from a dinner party he'd attended the previous week. He did not yet know their names. One man was saying that he had no interest in the afternoon session. He had what he came for. And then the other man had said something that lodged itself in Thomas's mind with the immediate, irreversible quality of a splinter driven deep. He said he knew what was coming in the afternoon session. He said they were finally selling her. He said she had been sitting in the holding pens for 3 weeks because nobody wanted to buy. And then he said something about a place called the Petton Estate, about 3 men dead inside of 2 months. 4 if you counted old Petton himself, though the doctor had ruled that 1 a heart attack. Mighty convenient timing, the man said. Mighty convenient timing indeed. Thomas took a careful step backward, away from the doorway, away from the 2 men. He turned these words over in his mind through the lunch hour, and when the auction resumed at 1 o'clock, he was watching the room more carefully than he had been that morning. He noticed who had not come back. He noticed how many chairs were empty that had been occupied before noon. He noticed the particular quality of the silence that fell over the room when Lot 43 was announced, the way it was different from the ordinary silence of an auction, heavier somehow, more deliberate, as if the silence itself was a decision that had been made collectively, without any words being exchanged. He raised his paddle anyway. The road from Savannah to the Waverly Plantation followed the Vernon River, and the journey took just over an hour in the late afternoon heat. Thomas rode up front in the wagon, Hutchins beside him. The 4 people he had purchased that morning were in the wagon bed behind them, and Celia walked separately, escorted by one of the property's existing workers. Thomas found himself glancing back at her more than he intended to. There was something about the way she held herself that made her impossible to simply categorize and dismiss. Most enslaved people in transit carried themselves with the careful, practiced invisibility of those who had learned that drawing attention was rarely advantageous. Celia seemed entirely indifferent to whether she was noticed or not. She was not defiant, she was not diminished. She simply existed in her own inner landscape at a distance that the chains around her wrists could not apparently reach. When they arrived at Waverly, the main house came into view through a double line of old oaks, their branches reaching across the road to form a canopy. Even in its current state of mild disrepair, the house was impressive, white paint fading in the low coastal light, the columned portico casting long shadows across the packed earth of the front yard. Beyond the house further back, the 2 long buildings of the quarters sat parallel to each other, and beyond them, stretching out toward the tree line, the cotton fields moved in a slight evening breeze like the surface of a slow-moving river. Hutchins organized the new arrivals efficiently. The 3 young men were assigned to the field gang and shown to the quarters. The cook was taken immediately to the main house kitchen, where she would begin learning the layout and provisions the following morning. When it came to Celia, Hutchins paused. He looked at her the way a man looks at a piece of furniture that he isn't entirely certain will fit through the door he needs it to go through. Thomas said she had medical training and should be set up in the old overseer's cabin near the quarters, where she could work as a midwife. Hutchins said there was already an older woman named Patience who handled such things. Thomas said Celia could assist her. Hutchins nodded slowly, the nod of a man who has reservations he doesn't yet feel entitled to voice. Celia was shown to the cabin. She said nothing during this process. She simply looked at each new environment with the same calm, assessing quality, as if she were taking measurements that only she needed to know. That evening, before Thomas had finished his supper, Josiah Crenshaw arrived. Crenshaw was a heavy-set man in his late 50s, one of the established planters of the county, the kind of man whose family had been in this particular piece of Georgia long enough that his opinion carried the weight of institutional knowledge. He was affable in the way that men of settled power are affable. He didn't need to perform his authority, and so he didn't bother. He and Thomas sat on the front portico with bourbon, watching the light go out of the sky over the Vernon River, and after an appropriate interval of pleasantry, Crenshaw set his glass down and said what he had actually come to say. He had been at the auction that morning, he had seen Thomas's purchase, and he wanted Thomas to know what he had not been in Savannah long enough to already know. He told Thomas about Harold Petton. Petton had been a planter of the old school, 60 years old, healthy and vigorous until very suddenly he was not. His death by itself would not have raised particular concern. Old men died, that was the nature of things, but the deaths that preceded his were harder to explain away. His personal physician, Dr. Simon Vance, had died approximately 6 weeks before Petton from what presented as influenza complications. Before that, Petton's overseer, a man named Kelly, had died of what was called brain fever. Before that, the plantation's driver, a man named Marcus, had been found in the stables with a broken neck. The official explanation was that a horse had kicked him. But Marcus, Crenshaw said carefully, was the kind of man who knew horses better than most men knew their own names. He had been working with horses his entire life. The explanation had satisfied the coroner. It had not particularly satisfied anyone who knew Marcus personally. 4 men, 6 weeks, and the common thread running through all of them was access. Specifically access to someone who moved through the Petton household freely, who prepared medicines and tonics, who had entrance to the kitchen and the sick rooms and the private spaces of the house. Someone with extensive knowledge of plants and their properties. Crenshaw leaned forward as he said the next part, his voice dropping even though there was no one within 30 yards who could hear him. She had reason, he said. Celia's daughter had taken sick in the spring, 16 years old, pneumonia or what looked like pneumonia. Dr. Vance had come to attend her, and Celia had stood in that sick room and told the doctor to his face that his diagnosis was wrong, his treatment was wrong, and that the combination of calomel and bloodletting he was prescribing would kill the girl faster than whatever illness had initially claimed her. Dr. Vance was apparently not accustomed to being contradicted by enslaved women. Petton had Celia removed from the room and later punished for her insubordination. The girl died 3 days later in agony, calling for her mother, while her mother was confined to a barn. 2 weeks after the funeral, Dr. Simon Vance was dead, and then the others followed in sequence like a line of dominoes falling in very slow, very deliberate succession. Thomas listened to all of this without interrupting. When Crenshaw finished, Thomas asked what he was suggesting Thomas do about it. Crenshaw said he was not suggesting anything exactly. He was providing information as a courtesy from one neighbor to another, but if he were Thomas personally, he would sell the woman quickly, or put her in the fields where she had no access to food or drink or medicine. He would not, under any circumstances, allow her to remain in a position where her particular skills could be directed toward whatever targets she had in mind next. Crenshaw stood, shook Thomas's hand, wished him success with the Waverly property, and rode back down the oak-canopied road into the gathering dark. Thomas sat alone on the portico for a long time after that. The bourbon in his glass was untouched. Somewhere across the fields, an owl was calling into the August night with a sound that seemed, in that particular moment, more like a question than a comment. He went to her cabin that evening. He told himself afterward that he had gone to make an assessment, to look at the situation clearly and decide rationally how to proceed. But the truth was that Crenshaw's story had placed Celia inside a kind of narrative that Thomas found he could not resist investigating at close quarters. She was sitting on the rough bed when he arrived, her hands unbound, her posture straight in a way that had nothing to do with any instruction anyone had given her. She stood when she saw him, the reflex of a lifetime of enforced deference, but her eyes met his directly and held. He asked about her skills. She told him about them plainly, without embellishment or false modesty. Her mother had been a midwife, her mother's mother before that. She had learned by watching, then by doing, and later by reading every medical text she could obtain access to, supplemented by a tradition of plant knowledge that had been carried across the ocean from a continent she had never seen, maintained in the memories and practices of women who had understood that knowledge was the one thing that could not be confiscated, the one thing that survived passage and chains and the systematic destruction of every other form of identity and culture. She said she could read English. She said this without pride and without apology, simply as a statement of fact, the way she might state her age or the county where she had been born. He asked her about the Petton estate. She said people die. She said it was the one certain thing in the world. He pressed her. She looked at him with those dark, still eyes and said something that Thomas would turn over and over in his mind for months afterward. She said they didn't understand that debts come due one way or another. Everything balances in the end. He asked her directly, did you kill those men? And she smiled, not warmly, not coldly. Somewhere in between, in the zone where the most complex human expressions live. She said you cannot kill a man with words or prayers or with hoping real hard that justice finds him. She said if they died, it was divine providence or their own sins catching up with them at last. She said she was just a slave. She said slaves didn't have the power to do anything but what they were told. Every sentence was technically true, not one of them was the whole truth. Thomas recognized this and recognized also that he was not going to be able to prove otherwise, and that the proof, even if he could find it, was not going to change the practical situation he was in. He told her she would work as midwife under old patient's supervision. He told her whatever had happened at the Petton place was finished, and they were starting fresh here at Waverly. She said, yes, master. Understood perfectly. He walked back to the main house through the warm August dark, and he slept badly that night for the first time in what would prove to be a very long pattern of bad nights to come. The harvest season arrived in late September with its usual urgency. Dark clouds had been building over the Atlantic for days, the particular bruised purple of a serious storm, and word was coming up from the coast that a late-season hurricane was bearing down on the Georgia shoreline. In the cotton economy, a hurricane at harvest time was not a natural disaster. It was a financial catastrophe. If the bolls weren't picked before the storm hit, an entire year's labor and investment could be destroyed in 18 hours. Thomas drove his workforce hard, the way all planters drove their workers during harvest, not with unusual cruelty, but with the particular relentlessness of a man whose financial future depended on the speed of other people's hands. They worked from before dawn to past dark. The cotton came in bale by bale, and Thomas watched the sky and calculated the margins and pushed forward. Celia was not in the fields. She had been assigned to work with Patience, the older woman who had been managing the plantation's medical needs, and within 2 weeks even Hutchkins, who had maintained a careful, quiet skepticism about the new arrangement, reported that the two women had reached an understanding. Patience, it seemed, was neither threatened by Celia's deeper knowledge nor too proud to learn from it. Celia had proposed an herb garden, a proper one, organized and labeled, growing the plants she needed for the most common conditions she would encounter. Thomas approved it without particular deliberation. The garden would keep her occupied, patients would supervise, and the whole arrangement seemed like a reasonable management of a resource he had accidentally acquired. The garden began as a small plot behind the quarters building: comfrey for wounds, feverfew for headaches, willow bark for pain, chamomile for the stomach, elderberry for strength. Each plant was labeled in Celia's neat, precise handwriting, and she kept a journal documenting the properties and applications of each one. Thomas saw the journal once during this early period and noticed that the entries were detailed, clinical, careful. He did not look closely enough to see the other entries, the ones written in a different register, the ones that were not about plants at all. That discovery would come later. The hurricane struck on October 12th. It came ashore in the early morning hours and did not finish with Chatham County until the following afternoon. The storm took roughly 20% of the cotton harvest. It tore part of the roof off the quarters building. It flooded the lower fields and bent a dozen old trees sideways. When the winds finally dropped and people came out to assess the damage, there was a kind of stunned, exhausted silence over the plantation, the silence of people who have been through something violent together and are not yet ready to take stock of what it cost them. 2 days after the hurricane, the illness started. It began with the children, the way these things often do: fever and chills and a cough that started dry and became wet and deep in the chest within 24 hours. Within 3 days it had spread to adults. Within a week, 23 people were sick, including 3 house servants and Hutchins's wife. The young physician who rode out from Savannah to assess the situation looked overwhelmed from the moment he dismounted. He prescribed the standard treatments of the era: calomel, rest, warmth. He predicted the fever would break on its own within the week and rode back to the city, leaving Thomas with a list of instructions that reflected the medical consensus of 1859, which is to say, a set of interventions that we now know with complete certainty caused more deaths than they prevented. Thomas went to the quarters that evening and found Celia already there, moving between the sick with old patients trailing behind her. She had organized them with a systems-thinking efficiency that no one had asked for, and that would have seemed, in that moment, almost remarkable if Thomas had been paying close enough attention to notice it. She had grouped the patients by severity. She had identified which children were most critical. She was checking temperatures with her hand and listening to breathing with her ear pressed against chests, and looking at eyes and tongues with the focused, systematic attention of someone who had been trained in exactly this kind of triage. Thomas told her the doctor had prescribed calomel. She did not look up from the child she was examining. She said calomel made it worse, that it weakened people more than the fever did, that if he wanted these people to live he should let her treat them her way. He asked what her way would look like. No calomel, willow bark tea for the fever, honey and garlic for the cough, elderberry to strengthen the body's resistance, boiled water, not river water, to keep the sick hydrated. And most importantly, keep the sickest patients physically separated from the less sick. Because whatever this illness was, it spread through proximity. It passed between people through the air they breathed. This was not the accepted medical theory of 1859. The dominant understanding of infectious disease in that era was still centered on miasma, the idea that illness arose from bad air rather than being transmitted between individuals. The germ theory of disease would not achieve broad acceptance for another 2 decades. What Celia was describing was not simply unconventional. It was, by the standards of her time and place, essentially unscientific. Thomas should have dismissed it. Instead, he thought about the pattern he had observed, the way illnesses did seem to move through households in waves, the way separating sick people from healthy ones seemed to slow those waves. He had noticed this without ever articulating it as a principle. Celia had articulated it as a principle, and not because she had read it in any current medical text. Because someone, somewhere in the long chain of women who had passed this knowledge from mother to daughter across generations, had observed it and remembered it and made sure it survived. "Do it your way," Thomas said, "but if people start dying, it becomes your responsibility." She looked at him with those steady, dark eyes and said that people dying was always someone's responsibility. The question was simply whose. Then she turned back to her patient, and Thomas went back to the main house, and for the next week he stayed out of the quarters and let Celia work. Within 3 days, the fever began breaking in the first patients. Within a week, all but 2 had recovered, and those 2 were elderly people whose bodies had already been weakened by years of hard labor and poor nutrition. Under the treatment the young doctor from Savannah had recommended, Thomas had a strong, private suspicion that the death toll would have been significantly higher. He did not share this suspicion with anyone, but he was not a man who could fail to draw the obvious conclusion. Word of what had happened during the outbreak moved through Chatham County, the way all significant news moved in that era, through the invisible network of communication that existed between enslaved people across neighboring plantations, through their owners' conversations at church and at dinners, and at the informal meetings that constituted the social infrastructure of the planting class. By early November, Thomas was receiving visits from neighboring planters asking to borrow Celia's services. He agreed, partly out of the neighborly obligation that the social structure of the county required, and partly because the arrangement brought income. Celia was sent to the Mansfield plantation to treat a case of yellow fever. She was sent to the Rutledge place to manage a difficult childbirth that had been going badly for 2 days. She was sent to a farm near the Ogeechee River to treat a snake bite with a severity that had the local doctor predicting amputation. In each case she succeeded where others had failed or given up. The baby at the Rutledge place was delivered safely, the mother surviving without the infection that frequently claimed women after difficult labors. The snake bite healed without amputation. The yellow fever patient at Mansfield recovered in a week. Her reputation spread and deepened. In the conversations that happened across fence lines and at market and after Sunday services, her name was spoken with a quality that existed somewhere between admiration and unease. She could heal what couldn't be healed. She knew things that no one could entirely explain. And underneath those remarks in the lower register where the whispers lived, people were also remembering the Petton estate. They were doing arithmetic. They were arriving at conclusions they did not voice directly, but that informed the way they looked at Celia when she passed. Thomas heard these whispers. He told himself they were the predictable product of superstition and provincialism, that people who could not understand competence defaulted to accusing it of being something supernatural or sinister, that Celia's success in treating illness was medicine and not magic, and that the deaths at Petton's were most likely coincidence. He told himself these things with the concentration of a man who is not entirely convinced by his own arguments. December came. The cotton had been harvested and sold, the price acceptable despite the hurricane loss. Thomas allowed himself a measure of cautious satisfaction. He had survived his first year as a plantation owner without major catastrophe. He had a functional workforce, a functioning medical practitioner, a farm in reasonable condition. The whispers about Celia were just whispers. Everything was going to be fine. Then the first sign appeared, and everything stopped being fine. Before we go any further into this story, if you've made it this far, you already know this is not a simple tale. Hollow Century is the channel that brings you the stories that were buried, the histories that were suppressed, the human beings who were written out of the official record because what they did and who they were made the powerful people of their time profoundly uncomfortable. If that's the kind of history you want more of, subscribe right now and hit the notification bell. We put out new episodes every week, and every one of them is built on this same principle. The past is never as simple as the people who control the record want you to believe. Subscribe, we'll be waiting for you. It was Hutchkins who came to the main house that Tuesday morning in December, his face the color of old ash, his hands shaking with the particular tremor of a man who has seen something he cannot immediately file into any existing category of experience. He said Thomas needed to come to the quarters. Now, the crowd that had gathered near the north end of the quarters building parted when Thomas arrived, and what he saw on the wall stopped him in his tracks. Someone had painted a symbol on the weathered wood, drawn in what appeared to be dark red clay or dried blood, large enough to be seen clearly from a distance. The symbol was complex and precise, a circle with lines radiating outward at calculated intervals, smaller circles positioned at specific points along those lines, and in the center, pressing flat against the wood, a handprint, adult-sized, fingers spread wide. The kind of handprint that did not look like an accident or a piece of casual vandalism. It looked deliberate. It looked like a statement. Thomas demanded to know who had done it. The silence that answered him was the second kind he had encountered since buying Celia, the kind that wasn't simply absence of sound but was instead a form of communication in itself. Then an older man named Daniel spoke carefully. He said his grandmother had known about signs like this one, old magic, African medicine that came from before anyone in that yard had ever been born. He said his grandmother had told him these signs were dangerous, that they called on powers that had long memories and did not extend forgiveness. He said signs like this one usually meant someone was working roots, calling on the old ways, and when someone called on the old ways, bad things followed. Thomas ordered the symbol washed away immediately and announced severe punishment for anyone caught creating such things. The crowd dispersed. The symbol was scrubbed from the wall by evening. The fear did not wash away with it. 3 days later, Hutchins's prize hunting dog was found near the well, body rigid, mouth showing the dried remnants of a foam that spoke of something fast-acting and chemical rather than natural. The dog had been healthy at dawn. By mid-morning it was dead. A week before Christmas, a field worker named Samuel collapsed during the evening meal, clutching his abdomen with both hands, face twisted with a pain that was clearly far beyond ordinary stomach trouble. By the time Celia was summoned, he was vomiting violently and convulsing in intervals. She examined him with careful, systematic hands, and her expression said everything before her words did. This was not natural illness. The symptoms were consistent with plant toxins, something fast-acting, something that had been ingested within the last few hours. She looked at Thomas and said the question wasn't what had poisoned him, but who had given it to him. Samuel died 3 hours later, in full view of several dozen people, in a manner that no one who witnessed it would describe as peaceful. The plantation's fragile equilibrium shattered. The fear that had been building in careful layers since October exploded into something that was barely distinguishable from panic. Thomas ordered a thorough investigation. He questioned everyone who had been near Samuel that day. He examined the communal pot from which Samuel had eaten. He tested the well water. He found nothing conclusive. Samuel had eaten what everyone else had eaten. He had drunk what everyone else had drunk. He had no known enemies among the other workers. There was no obvious reason, no obvious mechanism, no obvious perpetrator. Unless, Thomas thought, sitting alone in his study that night with a lamp burning low and the December wind pushing at the windows, unless Samuel hadn't been the intended target at all, unless this was something else entirely, a demonstration, a proof of concept, unless someone was practicing. Christmas at Waverly Plantation that year was a muted, anxious affair. Thomas had planned a proper celebration for his workers, 3 days of rest and additional rations, the kind of minimal acknowledgement of the holiday that was common on plantations that wanted to maintain the appearance of benevolence. But Samuel's death had cast a shadow over everything, and the gifts were received with the hollow courtesy of people who were afraid and unsure of what they were afraid of, only that the source of that fear was somewhere very close by. On Christmas evening, the screaming started from the direction of the quarters. Thomas grabbed the pistol from his study desk, a reflex he had not needed on the plantation before, and ran out into the cold night toward the sound. The torchlight had already gathered a crowd around the well. 2 men were holding a young woman named Ruth, a house servant who worked in the laundry, 19 years old, a person Thomas had never known to be anything other than quiet and compliant. She was fighting the men holding her with a frantic, disorganized strength, her eyes wide and moving fast, not focused on anything that was actually in the yard. She was talking continuously, the words overlapping and not quite connecting into coherent sentences, something about voices and shadows and things she had done and debts that were coming due. Debts coming due. Thomas heard those words and felt the temperature of his blood drop by several degrees. They were the same words Celia had used on that first evening in the cabin, not similar words, the same words, the exact same formulation. He looked around the circle of torchlit faces and found Celia at the edge of the crowd, standing with the absolute stillness of someone who had chosen precisely where to stand. She had not been summoned, she was already there as if she had known. She moved forward when Thomas arrived, and the crowd separated for her with the instinctive deference that it had developed over the past several months in response to something it perhaps did not consciously understand. She approached Ruth and spoke to her in a voice Thomas had not heard before. It was low and even and warm in a way that her voice almost never was, carrying a register of genuine tenderness that seemed entirely at odds with everything Thomas thought he had understood about her. Ruth's frantic eyes found Celia's face and locked onto it with the desperate relief of a drowning person locating a fixed point in turbulent water. She said, "You know." She said, "You understand." She said, "Tell them what I did." Celia said, "Hush." She said, "What's done is done and what's coming will come regardless." She said there was no need to tell anyone anything. And then Ruth, her voice dropping to a cracked, broken register that barely qualified as a whisper, said that she hadn't meant for him to die. She said she had just been so angry. She said he had no right to touch her the way he had. She said she had only wanted to hurt him, to teach him a lesson, and she had picked the mushrooms for that purpose. She had not known they would kill him. She swore she had not known. The yard went completely still. Thomas felt the weight of what Ruth had just said pressing down on him like a physical force. She had poisoned Samuel. She had done it with mushrooms she believed would make him sick but not kill him, and she had been wrong about the dose or the variety or both, and a man was dead, and here was the confession, delivered publicly to a crowd of witnesses, to the owner of the plantation in the middle of Christmas night. Celia pressed 2 fingers briefly to Ruth's forehead. It was a gesture that looked ritualistic. She produced a small bottle from her pocket, uncorked it, held it to Ruth's lips and told her to drink. "It will calm the voices," Celia said. "It will quiet the shadows. You'll sleep, and when you wake up you'll be at peace." Ruth drank without any resistance and was almost immediately quiet. Within minutes her body relaxed and she was carried to an empty cabin to be watched through the night. Thomas grabbed Celia's arm before she could follow. What had she given her? "Valerian root," Celia said. "Chamomile, poppy extract, things to ease the mind and bring sleep." Thomas asked why Ruth had known which mushrooms to use, where she had gotten that knowledge. Celia said the girl had been foolish, that she had picked the wrong variety by mistake. That guilt had done the rest, had eaten through the girl's mind from the inside until there was nothing holding her sense of reality together. He asked if Celia had taught her. She said she gave knowledge to those who came to her for it. She said knowledge itself was neutral, that what people did with it was their own affair, their own choice, their own consequence. Ruth died 2 days later. She simply stopped breathing during the night, peacefully. Celia examined her and recorded the cause of death as heart failure brought on by extreme emotional distress. Nobody challenged the ruling, and Thomas stood at the edge of Ruth's grave in the cold December ground and understood, with a clarity that he found both enlightening and deeply frightening, that he was dealing with something that operated on a level of complexity he had profoundly underestimated. The winter tightened around Waverly like a fist. January brought an ice storm that coated every surface in a thin, hard layer of crystal and brought plantation operations to a standstill. Thomas used the enforced confinement to do the thing he had been avoiding since the night in December when Ruth had made her broken, public confession. He waited until Celia was across the plantation attending to Hutchins's wife, who had recently fallen ill with a wasting condition that seemed to resist the usual treatments. Then he went to her cabin. The space was organized with an almost obsessive precision. Bundles of dried herbs hung from the ceiling beams, each one labeled in the same careful script Thomas had seen in the garden. Bottles and jars lined the shelves along one wall, each containing something labeled and measured. The work table held the tools of her trade: mortar and pestle, a small balance scale measuring spoons of various sizes, a row of empty bottles waiting to be filled. It was the cabin of a trained practitioner, someone who took their work seriously enough to maintain exact records and consistent standards. Under ordinary circumstances, it would have been reassuring. Under these circumstances, it was not. Beneath the bed, wrapped in cloth and pushed against the back wall, Thomas found the wooden box. He unwrapped it carefully and opened it to find notebooks, their pages dense with Celia's writing. The early pages were what he expected: clinical notes on patients, records of treatments and outcomes, observations on the properties of specific plants. Detailed, careful, professional. But as he read further, the register shifted. The entries changed quality. And Thomas found himself reading something that was not a medical journal at all, but a ledger. A moral ledger, tracking not symptoms and remedies, but something far more complex. Actions and consequences, rights and wrongs, power and its exercise, debt and its collection. One entry dated October 15th read, 23 sick, 21 saved. The power to heal is the power to choose who lives. They do not understand this. They think my knowledge belongs to them because they own my body. But knowledge cannot be owned. It can only be shared or withheld. I share it with those who deserve it. I withhold it from those who do not. This is the only power I have, and I wield it carefully. Every life saved is a debt in my favor. Every death prevented is a weight on the scales. When the scales balance, justice will be served. Thomas's hands were shaking by the time he reached the bottom of the second notebook. He found one final document, wrapped separately in oilcloth, a single sheet of yellowed paper in a different hand. It was a letter. It was addressed to my daughter. It was signed Phoebe and dated March 1838. The year Celia would have been approximately 10 or 11 years old. The letter instructed her daughter to remember what she had been taught. It said the plants are neither good nor evil. They simply are. We choose how to use them. It said to heal when the scales are balanced and to harm when justice demands it. But always keep the ledger. Every choice made must be recorded and remembered. It said we are not slaves, though they call us such. We are keepers of the old knowledge, and that knowledge makes us free in ways they cannot understand or take from us. Thomas heard footsteps outside. He replaced everything precisely as he had found it, barely making it to his feet before Celia opened the cabin door. She stopped in the doorway, and her eyes moved from his face to the bed to the floor beside it with an expressiveness that her face did not otherwise betray. She said Hutchins's wife was asking for her husband. She said Thomas should probably go inform him. Then she stepped inside and closed the door, and she looked at Thomas without any particular surprise, and she said, "You've been in my things." There was no point in denying it. He said he had. He said he had found the notebooks. He said he knew what she had been doing. And then Celia told him what had really happened at the Waverly Plantation, not in the language of hints and philosophical statements she had used that first evening, but directly, clearly, as a matter of record. She told him about her daughter Sarah. She told him that Sarah had been 17 when she contracted the lung infection, not 16 as people generally assumed, and that she had been strong and smart and the kind of person who made you believe the world might contain possibilities it had not yet revealed. She told him about Dr. Vance arriving drunk, his impairment visible in his eyes and his breath and the imprecision of his movements. She told him about contradicting the diagnosis and being ignored. She told him about the punishment that Petten ordered for a slave woman who had the presumption to tell a white doctor that he was wrong. She told him about the barn, about the ropes, about what she heard from the barn as her daughter died in the house 20 yards away. And then she told him, with the same clarity and the same lack of apology, exactly what she had done about it. Foxglove for Dr. Vance, administered carefully in small doses over several weeks in the tonics she prepared for him as part of her household duties, designed to produce symptoms indistinguishable from natural cardiac deterioration. Marcus, the driver, had helped hold her down during the whipping. Kelly, the overseer, had laughed. Petten owned them all, had built and maintained the system that allowed a man to arrive drunk to save a dying girl and face no consequences, and had then punished the girl's mother for objecting. They had each received what Celia had determined they deserved. The scales had balanced. She was not sorry for any of it. Thomas stood in the cold, herb-scented cabin and felt the ground shift beneath his understanding of everything. Because the woman standing in front of him was not simply a murderer. She was not simply a healer. She was both of those things simultaneously, held together by a philosophy that had its own internal consistency, its own logic, its own moral architecture. She had killed 4 men. She had also saved 21 people during the outbreak and delivered dozens of healthy children into the world. How were you supposed to weigh those things against each other? How were you supposed to locate the moral center of a person who could do both, deliberately, by design? He asked her what happened now. She said that depended on him. He could try to move against her, but he would not succeed. Too many people on this plantation depended on her. Too many people trusted her. If he moved against her, he would have something close to rebellion on his hands before the week was out. Or she said he could look the other way. He could let the scales balance themselves and benefit from her skills. His workers would be healthier. His yields would be higher. The only thing it cost was his conscience, and occasionally the life of someone who had, by her assessment, earned what was coming to them. She asked him whether he was guilty of anything, whether he had harmed someone who did not deserve it, killed someone through cruelty or negligence, because if he had not, she said, he had nothing to fear from her. She did not punish the innocent, she only balanced the scales. Then she left, closing the door softly behind her, and Thomas stood alone in the cold January afternoon, surrounded by jars of herbs and bottles of tinctures, and the fading smell of her certainty. And he tried to remember the last time he had been so completely at a loss. This is the moment we stop and tell you something true about Hollow Century and about why this channel exists. The history that fills standard textbooks is, at best, incomplete. At worst, it is a selective fiction designed to make the people with the power to write history look like the inevitable heroes of a story that was never as simple as they wanted you to believe. The real history, the history of the people who did not write the books, who could not write the books, who were actively prevented from writing the books, is full of stories like Celia's, full of intelligence and strategy and moral complexity and a kind of power that doesn't show up in official records because official records were never designed to acknowledge it. We find these stories, we tell them. Subscribe to Hollow Century and make sure you never miss another one. Hit the notification bell, leave a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from, and share this video with someone who needs to understand that history is much larger and much stranger, and much more morally complex than anyone was ever taught in school. Hutchins's wife died on January 9th. She had been fading for the better part of 2 weeks, her strength going out of her day by day, her color diminishing, her appetite disappearing until she was simply the shape of herself, breathing shallowly, declining the food that was brought to her, not in dramatic gestures but in the small, final way of someone who has stopped engaging with the project of continuing. Celia tended her throughout. Celia was present at the end. And Hutchins, who had sat at his wife's bedside for 3 days running, came out of that cabin a different man than the one who had gone in. The change was immediate and profound. The lean, precise overseer who had managed Waverly with systematic efficiency became something hollow. He continued showing up to work, he continued giving instructions, but the quality of attention behind those instructions had drained away. He was performing competence rather than exercising it, and the people under his management noticed the difference faster than Thomas did. By February, the drinking had started. Not occasional drinking, but the methodical, deliberate drinking of a man who has found that the space between sobriety and oblivion is the only one in which he can function. By the end of that month, Thomas was spending most of his own time effectively managing the operations that Hutchkins was nominally overseeing, and the situation was clearly not sustainable. He promoted Daniel, just as Celia had predicted he would. Daniel received the promotion with the quiet, measured dignity of a man who was not surprised, but was also careful enough not to show that he wasn't surprised. His approach to management was different from Hutchkins's in ways that were initially counterintuitive to Thomas. He was less authoritative and more persuasive. He explained rather than simply commanded. He negotiated rather than simply dictated. And within 3 weeks, the production numbers under Daniel's oversight were actually better than they had been under Hutchkins at his most effective. The people who worked for Daniel did so with a different quality of attention than the people who had worked under Hutchkins. They did not work harder, but they worked better, in the way that people always work better when they have a reason beyond fear to do so. Thomas observed all of this and filed it alongside everything else he was accumulating, the evidence that was slowly reordering his understanding of how authority actually functioned, how real control was exercised, where genuine power resided. Spring arrived with the first warmth. Celia's herb garden expanded with new plantings, and so did her network of students. Thomas had begun to notice this network without initially having a word for what he was seeing. Women who had spent time with Celia over the course of the winter emerged different, more settled in themselves, more direct in small ways that were individually easy to dismiss but collectively amounted to something he could see but not quite name. They moved differently. They looked at him differently, or rather, they looked at him with the same surface deference, but with a quality behind the surface that had not been there before. He thought of Celia's mother's letter. Knowledge makes us free in ways they cannot understand or take from us. March brought Robert Petton to Waverly. He arrived in the afternoon on an expensive horse, dressed in the clothing of Charleston money, and he had the bearing of a man who had spent weeks building himself up to a difficult conversation and was determined to deliver it regardless of the reception. He was Harold Petton's nephew, the one who had inherited the estate and sold it off quickly. He told Thomas he wanted to buy Celia. He said 5 times what Thomas had paid, $60. Thomas said no, he said she was not for sale. Petton's voice hardened and he said what he had clearly come to say, laying out the full sequence of events at the Petton estate in a careful, measured progression that Thomas recognized as the rehearsed recitation of a man who has been trying to make people believe him for several months and has mostly failed. 4 deaths, one common thread, a pattern that could not simply be coincidence. He looked Thomas in the eyes and said he could see a pattern developing here at Waverly too. He named the deaths: Samuel, Ruth, Hutchkins's wife. He told Thomas he was a fool if he couldn't see where this was heading. Thomas said his answer was final. He said Celia was an essential member of his plantation's operation and was not for sale to settle someone else's personal grievance. Petton stood and looked at him for a long moment with an expression that mixed contempt with something that might have been genuine pity, and then he left. Thomas stood on the portico and watched him ride away down the Oak Avenue, and felt the particular unease of a man who has just successfully defended a position he is not entirely certain deserves defending. That evening, Thomas went through his records. He documented every death and illness that had occurred since Celia's arrival, laid them out on paper where he could see them all at once. The pattern that Petton had described was there. He could not look at his own careful list and pretend otherwise. Samuel dead from poisoning in December, having spent time with Celia in the days prior for a minor injury. Ruth driven to madness and death within a week of confessing to Samuel's poisoning, with Celia present at her breakdown. Hutchkins's wife, treated by Celia for months, deteriorating in precisely the slow, steady progression Celia had predicted on the night she told Thomas about debts coming due. An elderly field hand dead in his sleep in November after apparently perfect health. A house servant dead from a fall down the main house stairs in January, a servant who had complained to Thomas about Celia just 3 days before. He counted 5 deaths, possibly more if he went looking carefully. but balanced against those 5 were 21 people alive who would have died without her during the October outbreak, 37 successful births, dozens of smaller interventions that had prevented serious injury or illness from becoming fatal. He was not able to do the arithmetic in a way that produced a clear answer. He wasn't sure any arithmetic could. He began taking precautions. He stopped eating food unless he had personally watched it being prepared. He locked his bedroom door and kept the loaded pistol on the table beside his bed. He avoided being alone with Celia whenever possible. He told himself he was being sensible. He told himself precaution was different from paranoia. He did not sell her, did not send her away, did not confront her or restrict her or do any of the decisive things that the precautions might have suggested were necessary. He protected himself in the small ways and left the large ways alone, because the large ways would have cost him more than he had yet decided he was willing to pay. And then, on the morning of April 15th, he found the bundle on his doorstep. It was small, wrapped in cloth, tied with twine. Inside were dried herbs he did not recognize and a folded piece of paper. The handwriting was Celia's. "For your health, master, steep 1 spoonful in hot water each morning. It will ease the tension you carry and help you sleep better at night. Consider it a gift from someone who wishes you no harm as long as you continue to deserve none." Thomas read the note twice, then he read the conditional clause a 3rd time. As long as you continue to deserve none. He looked at the herbs in his palm. They might have been exactly what she said they were, a genuine remedy for the sleeplessness and anxiety that had been visibly eroding his health. They might have been something else entirely. He had no way of knowing. That was precisely the point. She was telling him in the clearest possible language that a woman in her position could use that she knew everything. She knew his precautions, she knew his fear. She knew that he was lying awake at night listening to the house settle and wondering which creak was natural and which was not. And she was telling him that his survival was her choice and had always been her choice, and that the loaded pistol and the locked door were theater. If she wanted him dead, the lock and the pistol were irrelevant. He threw the herbs into the fireplace and watched them burn. He watched the smoke for a long time. Hutchkins died in early May. He was found in the old overseer's cabin, the same cabin where Celia had first been housed when she arrived at Waverly, with an empty bottle on the table beside him. It was a laudanum bottle, one that had been prepared months earlier for Hutchins's wife during the final painful weeks of her illness. The death was ruled a suicide. Grief and alcohol and the accumulated weight of things a man had done in his life that he could not stop examining in the quiet after the drinking stopped. All of these things combining to produce an ending that was, in the final accounting, unsurprising. Thomas asked Daniel whether Celia had given Hutchins the bottle. Daniel looked at him steadily and said that it mattered less than whether Hutchins had deserved the peace it gave him. He said the man had been already dead inside for months. That the body just needed time to catch up with what had happened in the soul. It was, Thomas realized, the same logic, the same framework, the scales, the balance, the slow, patient accounting of what people had done and what they therefore deserved to receive. He arranged the burial. He made the necessary entries in his records. He promoted another man to fill the position Daniel had vacated by moving up. Life at Waverly continued in its rhythms, the planting season advancing, the cotton growing, the days lengthening into the heavy heat of the Georgia summer. And beneath all of it, invisible to anyone looking at the plantation from the outside, the slower machinery of Celia's justice continued its movement, patient and precise, and entirely beyond Thomas's ability to stop or redirect. In mid-May, Josiah Crenshaw returned to Waverly. He had aged noticeably since the previous summer, the lines in his face deeper, his bearing less settled, carrying the particular exhaustion of a man who has been worrying about something specific for a long time without finding a solution. He sat on the portico with Thomas and said that he owed Thomas a more forceful warning than the one he had delivered the previous August. He said she was not simply a murderer. That would almost have been simpler. She was something more difficult to contain, because a murderer operates alone, and what Celia was doing was not operating alone. She was building a network. She was teaching other women her knowledge, spreading her philosophy across plantation lines, using the mobility her medical reputation afforded her to create connections between women on neighboring properties who were now meeting in secret, sharing what they had learned, talking about herbs and about balance and about debts that came due. He had 3 women on his own plantation who had changed after spending time with Celia, who moved differently, who looked at him differently. One of them had looked him directly in the eyes the previous week and said with complete calm that the old ways were coming back and he ought to remember that. Thomas listened to all of this and then said something that he had not planned to say, something that came out before he had evaluated it. He said that maybe they deserved it. Crenshaw stared at him. He said that Celia had gotten inside Thomas's head. Thomas said he was not sure that was wrong. He said she had saved 21 people. He said she had delivered dozens of babies. He said more had lived than had died around her, and wasn't that the definition of something net positive? Crenshaw stood up from his chair with the controlled abruptness of a man who has heard something that offends him more than anger can accommodate. He said that Thomas was rationalizing murder because the murderer happened to be useful. He said that was not justice. He said that was moral bankruptcy, and he left without another word. Thomas sat alone on the portico as the sun went down over the river. He thought about what Crenshaw had said. He thought about what Celia had said. He thought about the list of deaths in his ledger and the list of lives saved, and the fact that he was sitting here in the warm May evening, alive and unharmed, in a house he legally owned, on land that had been worked by people he also legally owned, and that the law had no problem with any of it. He thought about what it meant that the law had no problem with any of it. He thought about a 17-year-old girl named Sarah dying in a house 20 yards from a barn where her mother was tied to a post for the crime of telling the truth. He did not go inside for a long time. June at Waverly was the deep summer, the heat pressing down on everything without apology, the kind of weather that made every task feel like it was being done through water. The cotton was growing well, responding to the spring rain and the summer sun with the prolific indifference of a plant that does not concern itself with the suffering required to cultivate it. Celia's herb garden had expanded 3 times since its first planting. It now covered a substantial plot behind the quarters, organized with the precision of a laboratory and tended with the care of something that mattered deeply to the person responsible for it. Thomas found himself watching Celia work more openly than he had allowed himself to before. He watched her move between patients, watched the way she explained what she was doing to the women who were learning from her, watched the particular quality of attention she brought to every case regardless of its severity. She was not simply effective. She was, he realized, genuinely excellent, in the way that a person becomes genuinely excellent when they have devoted themselves to something with the full force of their intelligence and their passion, and the accumulated inheritance of everyone who came before them. The knowledge she carried was not just hers. It was her mother's and her mother's mother's, and it went back further than anyone in Chatham County could trace. It was old in a way that the newest American medical text on the shelf of the best doctor in Savannah could not claim to be. He thought about what Crenshaw had called her, a plague. He thought about Robert Petton's warning. He thought about his own list of the dead. And then he thought about what he had watched her do through an entire year of Waverly's life, the saving and the healing and the teaching, and he could not make the word plague fit the person he was looking at. He could not make monster fit either, though he had been close enough to what she was capable of to know that capability existed. What he was looking at was something more difficult than either of those words. He was looking at a person. A complete, complicated, brilliant, dangerous, compassionate, ruthless, remarkable human person, doing what she had determined needed to be done with the only tools available to her, in a world that had given her no other options and would have accepted her suffering as entirely natural if she had simply submitted to it. He was not sure when exactly that understanding had replaced the earlier, simpler assessments. He was not sure it changed anything practical, but it changed something inside him, something that had been quietly shifting since August and had now shifted far enough to notice. On June 23rd, Celia came to the main house and asked to speak with him privately. It was the first time she had initiated such a meeting since the confrontation in January. They sat in the study in the late afternoon light, and she told him that a man named Benjamin Lell was coming to Waverly the following morning. He owned a rice plantation on the Ogeechee River. His daughter was 17 years old and seriously ill, and the local physician could not help her. Lell was coming to beg Thomas's permission to use Celia's skills. She was telling Thomas this in advance because she wanted him to understand what was going to happen and why, and because she needed something from him, not permission, not authorization, just non-interference. She told him about Benjamin Lell. He had been at the Petton plantation on a business visit the day of the whipping. He had not participated, he had not held the rope or given the order. He had simply been there visiting, conducting his business, and he had seen them take Celia to the barn, and he had heard Sarah crying in the house, and he had said nothing, done nothing, continued his business visit and gone home, because it had not been his affair. Because it had not been convenient to make it his affair. Her daughter, Celia said, was 17, the same age Sarah had been. Thomas understood immediately what she was planning. She was going to let Lel stand outside his daughter's sick room and feel exactly what she had felt in that barn. She was going to let him beg, let him understand helplessness from the inside, let him experience the particular agony of watching someone you love suffer when the person with the power to help them simply declines to exercise that power. And then she said she would decide. Maybe she would heal the girl, maybe she would not. The scales would determine it. Thomas felt the familiar vertiginous sensation of the moral ground shifting beneath him. He said that was monstrous. She said, is it, or is it just a mirror? He had no answer that satisfied either of them. She told him that when Lel came, Thomas would have a choice. He could order her to treat the girl. He had that legal authority. She was his property and her skills belonged to him. But if he gave her that order, he would become part of the chain. He would become someone whose debt needed to be entered in the ledger. The threat was not stated directly. It did not need to be. She told him she was not asking for permission. She was asking for non-interference. Then she left, and Thomas spent another night pacing his room with the pistol on the table, and his mind moving in circles that never quite completed themselves. We're going to stop here for one moment, because what happens next in this story is one of the most extraordinary things we have encountered in any of the research that goes into making Hollow Century. What Celia chooses to do when Benjamin Lel arrives at Waverly the next morning tells you more about the true nature of her philosophy, her intelligence, and her moral vision than everything that came before it, and it is going to require your full attention. If you've watched this far, you already know that this channel is not going to give you a comfortable, simplified answer. We're going to give you the real thing, the complicated thing, the thing that history tried to bury. Subscribe, share, we'll finish this story together. Benjamin Lel arrived the following morning. He was a man in his late 40s who had clearly not slept, his eyes carrying the particular redness of sustained anxiety, his clothing correct but worn in a way that suggested a careless morning, attention already entirely consumed by the crisis waiting for him at home. He came to the point immediately. His daughter Catherine was gravely ill. She was 17. The doctor who had been treating her had made her worse. Lel had heard about Celia from 3 different people in the county, all of whom had reported outcomes that standard medicine could not explain. He needed her. He was willing to pay whatever Thomas asked. Thomas told him the fee was not the relevant question. He told him that Celia made her own decisions about which patients to accept, that if Lel wanted her help he would need to ask her himself, and that Thomas could not promise what her answer would be. Lel's expression cycled rapidly through confusion, affront, and then something that looked like the beginning of desperation. But you own her. Thomas said he knew that. He still could not promise what Celia would decide. Celia was summoned. She came to the study and stood inside the doorway and looked at Benjamin Lel with an expression that Thomas could not read. Lel looked at her and something crossed his face, a shadow of recognition, of memory arriving uninvited. He began to speak. He began with the formal courtesy of a plantation owner speaking to an enslaved woman, a certain practiced condescension built into the register. And then something happened to his voice as he got further into the request, and Celia simply stood there and waited. The courtesy fell away, the condescension fell away, and what replaced it was the unmediated desperation of a father who is afraid his daughter is going to die. He told her about Catherine. He described the symptoms. He described what the doctor had done and how she had gotten worse instead of better. He said she was 17, that she was the brightest person he had ever known, that she was everything he had worked for and everything he hoped the future held. And then something that Thomas had not anticipated, and perhaps Celia had. Lel's knees simply gave way and he was on the floor of the study, actually kneeling, his hands clasped. A man who had owned other human beings for his entire adult life kneeling in front of a woman who was legally someone else's property, begging. He was weeping openly. He said please. He said he would give anything. He said he would do anything, just save his daughter. The room was absolutely quiet. Thomas watched Celia's face. He watched the mathematics of whatever she was calculating play out behind those dark, still eyes. He held his breath. Celia said, "Stand up." Lel stood, still crying, wiping his face with the back of his hand in a clumsy, unguarded way. She said, "Do you remember the Petton plantation?" Lel said yes. She said, "Do you remember what you saw?" He said yes, voice barely audible. He said he remembered the barn. He remembered hearing a girl crying in the house. He remembered Celia being tied up. He said he had been a coward. He said it clearly without softening it. He said he had been a coward and her daughter had paid the price for his cowardice. He said he thought about it every day. He said he was sorry. He said he knew sorry was inadequate, but he didn't have anything else to offer. Celia looked at him for a long time. Thomas found he was holding his breath. Then she said, "Take me to your daughter. I'll examine her and do what I can." Lel's face transformed, not into relief exactly, but into something more fragile than relief, something that had been broken and was not yet sure it was allowed to reassemble. He said, "You'll help her." Celia said she was a healer. That was what she did. But she said she needed him to understand that the debt was not cancelled, that she would collect it eventually, not in money, not in favors, in something harder. She needed him to remember what this felt like. She needed him to carry the memory of this room and this floor and this moment and whatever happened with his daughter in the days ahead. And the next time he saw someone else in this position, helpless, begging, needing someone with power to exercise it on their behalf, she needed him not to look away. That was the payment. That was what the scales required. Lel nodded. He said yes, whatever she needed. She said that was exactly what she needed. Then she turned and walked out of the study, and Lel followed, and Thomas stood alone in the afternoon light, feeling that he had just witnessed something that he did not have adequate language for. Not a murder, not exactly a mercy. Something in the space between those things that might have been the closest thing to justice that the world of 1859 Chatham County was capable of producing. Celia returned 3 days later and reported that Catherine Lel would recover. The girl had been suffering from a serious infection of the lungs, made significantly worse by the calomel and bloodletting that the attending physician had prescribed, with the confident incompetence of a man whose credentials protected him from the consequences of his errors. Celia had stopped the harmful treatments immediately. She had cleared the infection using steam inhalation, specific herb-based preparations that reduced the inflammation in the lung tissue, and a regimen of nutrition designed to restore the girl's depleted strength. Within 24 hours of the treatment changing, Catherine had shown visible improvement. Within 3 days, she was well enough to sit up and eat. She would be fully recovered within 2 weeks. Thomas asked Celia whether she thought Lel would keep his promise. Celia said yes. She said fear changes behavior, but understanding changes the heart, and Lel now understood in a way he had not before. He had felt it. He would carry it. He would be different from now on, not perfectly different, not transformed overnight into a just man in an unjust world, but different in the specific way that matters, the way that makes a person act rather than look away the next time the choice presents itself. She said that was worth more than his death would have been, more than his daughter's death would have been. She said she could have let the scales balance differently and they would have balanced, but she had chosen what the balance would be. That was the power, not just to take, but to shape. Thomas looked at her across the study and said, "You could have let Catherine die. The scales demanded it by your own accounting." She said the scales demanded something. Yes, but she chose what that something would be. Her mother's letter had said to harm when justice demands it. But justice, she said, was not simply the mirror image of cruelty. Justice was the restoration of something that had been taken. What had been taken from Celia was her daughter, yes, but more than that, it was her power to protect her daughter, her ability to matter in a world that had designed itself to ensure that she did not. Taking Lel's daughter would not restore what had been taken, but making Lel understand, making him carry the knowledge of what it felt like to be powerless in the face of someone else's choice, that restored something, that balanced something real. Thomas did not have a counter-argument. He was not certain he wanted one. The summer deepened and the cotton grew, and the days continued their long Georgia, turning toward autumn. Life at Waverly had a surface that was almost normal to anyone looking at it from the outside. Fields managed efficiently under Daniel's leadership, herb garden expanding behind the quarters, medical consultations coming in from neighboring properties on a regular basis, a plantation running smoothly, a new owner finding his feet, everything proceeding in reasonable order. But the surface was all it was. Beneath it, everything had changed. Thomas was no longer a master in any sense that he recognized from his father's world or from the social expectations of the planting class he had been trying to join. He was the legal owner of a piece of land and the people on it, but the actual authority over that land and those people resided somewhere else. It resided in the herb garden and the notebooks and the quiet, steady network of women who were learning things that could not be confiscated. It resided in the accumulated trust of every person on that plantation who had been healed when they needed healing and taught when they needed teaching. It resided in knowledge, which was the one form of power that chains had never been able to successfully contain. He thought about the war that was coming. Everyone could feel it by the fall of 1859, the way you can feel a change in the weather before the first cloud appears, a pressure shift that your body registers before your mind catches up. South Carolina would go. Other states would follow. The entire legal structure that made Waverly and plantations like it possible was going to collapse, not because the people who benefited from it had changed their minds, but because the internal contradictions of the system had accumulated past the point of management, and the reckoning that Celia had been describing all along as inevitable was going to arrive not just for the people who owned slaves, but for the entire civilization that had been built on their labor and their suffering. When that happened, the people who would survive, who would more than survive, who would thrive, were the people who had something that did not depend on the legal system for its validity. Knowledge, skill, community, trust, the relationships between people who had reason to protect each other. Celia had been building that infrastructure for years, through every healing and every teaching and every careful, deliberate act of power. She had been preparing for a future that Thomas was only beginning to imagine. In early September, Thomas called Celia to his study one final time. She came without any particular expression of anticipation or guardedness, moving with the same quality of settled authority that she had always moved with, that quality that had nothing to do with any legal status and everything to do with who she actually was. Thomas told her he was going to manumit her. He was going to file the paperwork and make it official. He would cover the legal fees and handle the registration without any condition or requirement attached to it. Celia looked at him for a long moment. She asked why. He said because she was already free. She had been free in every way that actually mattered since at least the morning he had bought her at auction, possibly since long before that. The paperwork would only make the legal record consistent with the truth. She asked what he expected in return. He said nothing. He said she should stay at Waverly or leave Waverly, whichever she preferred. He said he was placing no conditions on the offer. She looked at him with a long, steady, assessing look, and then she said that he had learned something. Not everything she had tried to teach him, but enough to survive what was coming. She said she would stay at Waverly for now. These people needed her and she was not finished with the work of preparing them, but she would stay as a free woman, not as his property. She said that would change things, not dramatically, not immediately, but in the steady, accumulating way that real change always happened. He agreed. She nodded and she left his study, and he sat alone for a while with the last of the September light coming through the window. The manumission papers were filed in October 1859, making Celia legally free under Georgia law. It caused significant talk throughout Chatham County. Planters debated it at their dinners. Wives discussed it over their calling cards. Why would a man free a slave that valuable? What did he get in return? Nobody arrived at an answer that entirely satisfied them because the answer did not fit the categories they were operating with. Thomas did not offer an explanation. He had stopped trying to make his choices intelligible to people whose understanding of power had not yet been revised by the events of the past year. Celia continued her work. The network of women who carried her knowledge continued to grow. The patients continued to come from neighboring properties and from further away from the city, from places Thomas had not anticipated. Daniel ran the plantation with quiet competence. The cotton was harvested that fall in reasonable yields. The accounts at the Planters' Bank of Savannah remained in reasonable order. And at the edge of everything, moving closer by the day, the war was coming. Thomas Cornelius Pewitt wrote the final entry in his diary on December 31st, 1859, the last day of the last year before everything changed. He wrote it in the study where he had spoken with Celia so many times, by the light of a lamp that made long shadows on the walls. He wrote, "I purchased Celia for $12 on a sweltering August afternoon, and I believed I had secured a bargain. What I had actually acquired was a teacher, and the education she provided was not the one I would have chosen had anyone offered me the option of choosing. She showed me the difference between legal authority and moral power, between owning something and controlling it, between what the law permits and what the conscience can actually sustain without eventually breaking under the weight. I do not know whether the lessons she taught me make me a better man or simply a more honest one. I do not know whether I am innocent or complicit, saved or condemned. I know that I am different than I was when I came to Chatham County in the summer of 1859, young and certain and entirely unaware of what certainty costs when it meets the truth. We are standing on the edge of a reckoning that has been building for generations. When it finally arrives, I believe the people who will survive it, and perhaps shape what comes after, will be the ones like Celia. The ones who kept the knowledge alive when everything else was being taken. The ones who understood that true power does not reside in a legal document or a locked door or a loaded pistol on a bedside table. It resides in what you know, in what you can do, and in the relationships you build with people who have real reasons to keep you alive rather than dead. I can only hope that when the scales finally balance, I will have done enough to tip them toward mercy, but I no longer believe I am the one who gets to decide. I never was. The story of Celia and Thomas Pewitt did not end with the manumission papers filed in October 1859. History rarely ends cleanly. What it does is accumulate, one decision and one consequence at a time, until the weight of the accumulated decisions becomes too heavy for the existing structures to support, and something gives way, and something new emerges from the rubble. The Civil War began in April 1861, 16 months after Thomas wrote that final diary entry. Georgia seceded in January of that year, carrying Chatham County and the Waverly Plantation with it into a conflict that would determine, at enormous cost, whether the system that had produced the auction on Broughton Street and the barn at the Petton Plantation, and the deaths of 4 men and the grief of 1 woman, and the education of 1 conflicted planter, whether that system would be permitted to continue. It would not. The reckoning Celia had spoken of arrived, on schedule, as reckonings eventually always do. And when it arrived, the women who had gathered in Celia's herb garden and learned what she had to teach and carried that knowledge home to neighboring properties across Chatham County, those women were not simply freed, they were already equipped, they were already organized, they were already in the ways that mattered most, already what the law was catching up to recognize. What Hollow Century wants you to carry away from this story is not simply the drama of it, though the drama is real and it is significant. What we want you to carry is the structural truth it illustrates. The system of American slavery did not simply oppress people. It attempted to do something more ambitious and more impossible. It attempted to convert human beings into property by the exercise of sufficient legal and physical force. And what the story of Celia demonstrates, as clearly as any story in the historical record, is that this attempt failed. It failed not because the force was insufficient. The force was enormous and the legal framework was comprehensive and the social consensus that supported it was nearly total. It failed because the thing it was attempting was simply impossible. You cannot own a person's knowledge. You cannot shackle the capacity for judgment or chain the habit of moral reasoning. You cannot whip out of a woman the understanding of which plant cures and which plant kills, and when each is the appropriate response to the situation in front of you. You can burn the books and break the instruments and isolate the practitioner, and all of that was done systematically for generations, and still the knowledge survived. Still it traveled mother to daughter in the dark, in whispers, in the language of touch and memory. Still it arrived on the auction block in Savannah one August morning in 1859, wearing chains, and meeting the eyes of the man who had just accidentally purchased his own education. And still, it outlasted the men who tried to contain it. That is the story of Celia. That is the darkness that Hollow Century exists to illuminate, not because illuminating it is comfortable, but because the things we refuse to look at have a way of shaping us anyway. Better to look directly, better to understand what actually happened and what it actually means, better to know. The plantation auction system processed hundreds of thousands of human transactions between its earliest colonial antecedents and its legal termination in 1865. The records of most of those transactions are statistical, numbers in ledgers, prices paid, work performed, bodies accounted for. The human complexity of the people involved in those transactions, the knowledge they carried, the choices they made, the philosophies they developed in response to the conditions they were forced to live within, almost none of that appears in the official record. It was not the kind of thing the people who controlled the official record were interested in preserving. Hollow Century goes looking for it anyway. What we find consistently is that the people history tried hardest to erase were also the ones who were working hardest to ensure that the most important things survived. The knowledge that heals and the knowledge that judges and the long, patient practice of maintaining, under impossible conditions, the capacity for moral reasoning and the will to exercise it. It survived in herb gardens and in notebooks hidden under beds, and in the memories of women who understood that what you know is the one thing they cannot take away from you. Celia knew this, her mother Phoebe knew this and wrote it down on yellowed paper in 1838 and trusted it to her daughter and trusted her daughter to understand it. Every person who learned from Celia knew it in the way that people know things that have been tested by fire, and the planter who bought her for $12 on a hot August morning eventually learned it too in his own way at his own pace, paying his own portion of the education's cost. Not enough. Never enough. But something. The scales, as Celia said, balance. One way or another, in the fullness of time, everything balances. That is not a promise of comfort. It is simply an observation about the direction that history moves when you are standing far enough back to see the whole of it. And from that distance, the picture is clear. The things that were supposed to disappear did not disappear. The people who were supposed to be erased were not erased. And the darkness that people like Celia carried, not the darkness of cruelty, but the darkness of knowledge possessed by those who had no safe place to show it in the light, that darkness outlasted every structure that was built to contain it. That is what Hollow Century is here to tell you. The forgotten stories, the buried histories, the human beings who were written out of the official record because what they knew and what they did made the comfortable version of the past impossible to sustain. They were real, what they did was real, and it matters, not as a historical curiosity, as a living truth about what power actually is, where it actually resides, and what it actually takes to hold onto it when the world is working against you. Leave us a comment, tell us what you think of Thomas's choices, tell us whether you believe Celia was justified, tell us where you're watching from and what brought you to a channel that spends its time in the parts of history that other people preferred to leave dark. Subscribe if you haven't yet. Share this with someone who is ready to look at the real thing. We will see you in the next episode of Hollow Century, where forgotten darkness lives.